Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us in this webinar. We are on Zoom and streaming live on Facebook as well. My name is May Abu Mughli. I'm a senior researcher at the Center for Lebanese Studies, and it's my absolute pleasure to be facilitating this webinar today. In this webinar, we have three panelists who have a great deal of experience and have contributed immensely to the field of education, particularly education in contexts of conflict, emergencies, and mass displacement. So allow me to introduce the three speakers who I will present in the order in which they will be speaking. Firstly, we have with us Professor Mario Novelli. Mario is a professor in the political economy of education and the director of the Center for International Education at the University of Sussex. Our second speaker is Dr. Maha Shaib. Maha is the director of the Center for Lebanese Studies at the Lebanese American University. The center is actually hosting this webinar, so we do encourage you to check our website and presence on social media. We have so many exciting projects and programs. And last but not least, we have Professor Katrina Brun. Katrina is the director of the Center for Development and Emergency Practice at Oxford Brookes University. Before I invite the panelists to speak, I will give a bit of introduction and framing for this webinar. On the 9th of November of this glorious year, 2020, the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies, also known as INE, issued a report under the title 20 Years of INE Achievements and Challenges in Education in Emergencies. Since INE is the largest network globally that deals with education in emergencies and has more than 130 partners that are leading organizations in the field of education in emergencies and post-crisis recovery, as they call it. They also have thousands of members of both organizations and practitioners in this field. We thought that it would be a good timing to open the discussion about education in emergencies and critically engage with it. The INE report states that, and I quote, "New data shows that even prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, 127 million primary and secondary school-aged children and young people living in crisis-affected countries were out of school in 2019, or almost 1/2 of the global out-of-school population. Girls are more likely than boys to be out of school in crisis contexts. In 2019, the out-of-school rate for children and young people of primary and secondary school age living in countries affected by crisis was 31% for girls and 27% for boys," end of quote. This quote shows and draws a bleak picture made of numbers and levels of access or lack of access to schooling. I chose this particular quote as our three speakers will be critically engaging with issues related to what has become an industry of education in emergencies rather than a field of study, research, teaching and learning, or service provision. I believe that today's webinar is a great opportunity to have a space to discuss issues related to the fixation on numbers and statistics of access to schooling rather than the concept of education as a whole. Also, to bring to the fore the political economy of education, the politics of funding for research and service provision, the depoliticization of education and its funding, particularly in the so-called emergency context. We also will be talking about ethics of care and knowledge production within the realm of this expanding industry. Before I start, I'd like to encourage our audience who are joining us via Zoom to submit their questions using the questions box, which you can see at the bottom of the screen, so our speakers can respond to your questions during the Q&A sessions. It would be great if you address your question to a specific speaker. That will make my life much easier. So I would very much hope you would do that. Also, I'll be sharing some links of the latest pieces written by our panelists that are also related to the main themes we are highlighting in today's webinar. You will find that in the chat box. Without further ado, I'll ask Professor Novelli to start. Mario, you have 8 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope that you can see my screen. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Brilliant. So first of all, thanks, May, and thanks to the other colleagues on the panel. It's a real privilege to be invited to this. I've followed all of the fellow panelists' work and really pleased to take this opportunity to reflect a little on, as May has already said, 20 years of education in emergencies, and reflecting a little bit on that. So I want to begin with the positive, and I want to kind of reflect a little bit on really the successes of the field of education in emergencies over the last 20 years, and just list some of those. I think that, you know, there's been an amazing amount of work on raising awareness of the issue of education in crisis and conflict affected contexts, and the role of education, where education fits in relation to conflict and post-conflict recovery. Massive amounts of resources have been raised to support education in conflict and crisis. There have been major steps to improve coordination of the role of education and the delivery of education in conflict contexts, from the creation of the Interagency Network on Education in Emergencies in the late 90s to the creation of the Global Education Cluster, which coordinates education provision in the midst of humanitarian crisis. There has been real improvement in stakeholder coordination and systematization. During these last 2 decades, a cadre of committed practitioners and researchers have emerged, extremely committed and working often in incredibly difficult contexts. And they really have put education firmly on the map of issues related to conflict and crisis as part of the humanitarian cluster. In many ways, the education in emergencies sector is seen as a model for other sectors in terms of its capacity to coordinate, message, advocate. And within the research field, a really vibrant and coherent subfield of research and policy advice has emerged over the last 2 years, with its own research networks, debates, thematic debates, its own journal, massive amounts of funding streams, and a whole generation of doctoral students coming through that. So I think that, you know, we have to first, you know, take our hats off and really commend the fact that many people have dedicated their working lives as practitioners, researchers, advocacy specialists in this area. You know? However, and there's always a however with this, I think it's important to recognize that the field continues to be shaped by a broader politics of international development, both generally and specific to education in conflict and crisis. And these often undermine and distort the kind of humanitarian impulse, if you like. So I just want to step back and reflect a little bit more generally on the field. And I think that, you know, international development is one of these kind of Janus face phenomena that for some, international development is a kind of utopian idea of the rest catching up with the West. But for others, it's a tool for the West to ensure the reproduction of Western hegemony. It's a kind of seen as a continuation of empire, the transition from colonialism to neo-colonialism with new mechanisms. And education in emergencies as a subfield of this field of international development really needs to be understood in this geographical, historical, political, economic, and ideological context. And just like development, so education in emergencies as a field has the potential to emancipate, transform, challenge unjust structures, but it also often marginalizes, reproduces inequality, alienates, and humiliates. And I think that, you know, that kind of dialogue around social transformation or pacification, I think is something we need to hold on to. And, you know, I often think about this field as a kind of field that's been caught between white saviors with a white savior complex, good Samaritans, and Machiavellian characters that are drawing on the field to execute particular strategic plans. And, you know, when we teach international development, we often kind of talk about the President Truman's famous speech in 1948, where he coins the phrase international development and talks about how US-led hegemony is going to be very different from the old colonial empires of the past. The old imperialism, exploitation for foreign profit has no place in our plans, he says. What we envisage is a program of development based on the concepts of democratic fair dealing. And in a sense, that kind of quite paternalistic, quite kind of white savior in its illusion of the US at the top and the rest of the world needing to follow is kind of part of that story. But in parallel with that, and in secret in the US at that time in 1948, there was also another discussion going on, which is the Machiavelli side, where George Kennan, high up in the State Department, was saying we have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only a small, I can't read that, 6.3% of its population. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity, not to eliminate it, but to maintain it. Yeah. So I think that we need to hold these different aspirations in our grasp when we reflect a little bit on education in emergencies. And, you know, we can travel through the history of this from its emergence really in refugee education in the midst of the Cold War to the kind of end of Cold War, emergence of new wars, lots of outbreak, the kind of collapse of the Soviet bloc, rise of conflicts in Africa, where really provide the kind of geopolitical foundations that underpin lots of this education and emergency field. And Mai gave some statistics in the beginning about the amount of out-of-school kids, and it was really that 20 or more years ago, when educationists across the world were committed to education for all objectives, which called for universal primary education for everyone. And there was a recognition that more than 50% of out-of-school kids were in conflict-affected contexts. And that was the initial impetus for a big focus on education in emergencies. And, you know, the figures today are not great. It seems that 50% are still the number of kids out of school. From that onwards, we see a kind of increased politicization as we enter into a period of international wars, from the fallout from 9/11, occupations and invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, which have shifted the focus and the geographies of where education and emergencies has been engaged in. And more generally now we see it encroaching into areas of issues around education and radicalization that penetrate well beyond southern conflict contexts and into the heart of the north. And you know, the focus of my colleagues on refugees, we've really seen over recent years refugee education being ratcheted up, and a massive increase in that, precisely as those powerful nations in Europe and the United States want to ensure that refugees remain in their heartlands or in the peripheries around there, and not at the heart inside Europe and into the US. So we've really got to kind of understand the field itself emerging out of a range of different powers. And so just to kind of finish with my small section on 6 small points. Firstly, the funding, some key challenges for education in emergencies. Firstly, the funding political architecture is dominated by powerful nations and reflects their priorities. It's not just about the geography of funding, which is indeed highly skewed, but also sectoral and thematic priorities. Now, within that, education always fights. It's always a junior partner. It's always at the bottom of the pile. So education, if you like, has a double challenge there. The major agencies, INEE, UNICEF, UNHCR, operate within a very nation-state-centric architecture, which often means that most marginalized voices are not seen or heard, because agencies enter at the behest of states and act under their will and behest. So often when issues around marginalized communities, ethnic groups that are being persecuted or punished, whether educationally or politically, often states don't want to hear that. And agencies are tied up into this state-nation relationship. There is also a continuous, the center of power of this field, knowledge production, power control, is really New York, Washington, London. It's both geographically remote from many of these contexts and culturally homogenous. And there is a real need to decenter and diversify this field, because the way that it's been historically constructed is that there is a kind of binary of the Wild West out there that we need to intervene in, and conflicts start over there and we need to resolve them. But actually there is often a failure of reflexivity of the role of the West in reproducing the conditions under which these crises and conflicts emerge. And I think that that's really important absent. The fifth point is there is a continuous danger within this field of elite capture. What I would say is that he who pays the piper calls the tune. There is a danger of corporate capture at the moment in the era of private sector expansion, bridge academies, Pearson, a range of capitalist actors that are increasingly interested in this field. But that's always been the case in this field, that whether it's the USAID or the Dutch or the UK government, it's very easy to capture this field by investing funds and pushing agendas. Finally, and I won't say much because I know my colleagues are going to talk about research, but the research field reflects all of the above. It's often too driven by the needs of powerful actors. There's not enough critical, challenging research, precisely because of the funding cycles and the types of agencies that are involved in this. However, there is much more than before, and hopefully in the future there will be many more critical researchers that speak back to some of these challenges. Thank you. I hope I haven't abused my time.
Well, 2 minutes over, but it's fine.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mario. Very, very interesting points, and we already have 2-3 questions for you. So be prepared for that. Thank you very much for raising very important points in terms of contextualizing education emergencies in the field in a historical kind of context, which people don't really think about very much. So I think we have a lot to discuss later on. I'll move to Maha. Maha will be talking about knowledge production, which was one of the last points that you've raised, Mario, and much more. So Maha, the floor is yours.
Thank you, May, and thank you, Mario, for making this extremely valuable point. I want to follow up on your earlier point, which is indeed the field of education of refugees has certainly developed and witnessed more proliferation of research and writing. I just want to show this in numbers. I was looking in JSTOR on the number of publications that have education and refugees. And if we look between 1998 and 2009, there were 300 papers published with these two keywords. If we look at the past 10 years, I could find over 2,000 articles published in this field. So obviously we have seen a significant growth. And this is something massive, and this is something that is really good that has happened in the past 10 years. And I'm going to quote someone who I interviewed in the beginning of 2013, who worked for a Lebanese NGO in Lebanon, when I was asking her about the education of Syrian children in Lebanon. And she told me, with the Iraqis, we had 30,000 who came to Lebanon, and they came into the educational system and out of it. No one even spoke about it. No one even kicked the fuss. Hardly any research is done on the education of Iraqi refugees in Lebanon. Interestingly, the Syrian crisis has brought to the fore the need to address this particular, this particular issue, education in a humanitarian context, which Katrina is going to talk about. I'm going to, personally, my research has been focused on education of vulnerable children and disadvantaged children. I'm interested in the sociology and politics of education. I had done previously a study on the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon to understand their schooling experience after over 50 years of being in the Lebanese, part of the Lebanese educational system, yet being excluded from the society. And following over the 10 years, what made me interested more and more is to see how the field was progressing and how the discourse was changing. So I remember sitting with UNICEF senior officials in Lebanon at the beginning of the Syrian crisis, and everyone was talking about repatriation. The main discussion at that time was what curriculum we should teach them, because, is it going to be 1 month, 2 months, or 3 months? So everyone was thinking like, we have to teach them the Syrian curriculum, no the Lebanese. And I was very surprised at that time how actually hardly there was any plan or even vision or even literature or any kind of like data that tells us, is it better to teach the Syrian curriculum or the Lebanese curriculum? And then 1 to 2 years later on, the realization that most conflicts stay for 20 years have shifted the discussion to, we have to teach them the curriculum of the host country. And this is where the terminology of education in emergency became to kind of like, I'm thinking emergency, how long are we going to be staying in this emergency paradigm? Yet it was flourishing immensely. I would attend UNRWA meetings, and UNRWA, for those who are not very familiar, have been providing education for refugees for over 70 years. And suddenly they have a committee for education in emergency. I'm thinking, what emergency? This is a protracted context. So, but this is where I began to see how many of the notions in education of refugees haven't been really problematized, or we haven't paid enough time to think about them. The obsession was with access, how we can get as many numbers in as much as possible, as quickly as possible, and terminologies. I would read articles for researchers who would say the integration of Syrian refugees in the Lebanese educational system. And I'm thinking, what integration? The vast majority learn in second shifts, where they're forced to learn the Lebanese curriculum in a language that is alien to them, and then they are completely ostracized from the Lebanese society, the Lebanese economy. They're denied any any human right in terms of civic, social, and political participation. Yet all of these issues are hardly discussed. The apoliticization of education of refugees has been like something that I had to come in terms with. The other point that I want to focus on, which Mario, you touched on, is increasingly education of refugees becoming more concerned with nation state. And this is seen as we have to win the nation state, the host state, and bring it to our side. And often the debate is between the donors and the nation state, often at the expense of the refugees. If we look at the arrangement of education provisions for Syrian refugees in Lebanon, they have been certainly, on the whole, taking in consideration the interests of political powers in Lebanon, and obviously of the donors in Europe. Europe doesn't want refugees. It bluntly told UNICEF, take whatever money, but do whatever you can do to keep them in here. We don't want them to go to Europe. And in the name of radicalization, which is used in a negative way, or and Islamophobia, they've been, Lebanese politicians, unfortunately, fed into this discourse. Every refugee that goes to Europe, there's a percentage of them who are, terrorists. So unfortunately, the inclusion of refugees, and I say inclusion, in nation-state curriculums have not been problematized yet. At the moment, after 10 years of providing education for refugees, less than 4% make it to secondary. And this according to the Ministry of Education, the Lebanese Ministry of Education statistics. So after spending all of this money, all of this effort, the vast majority of refugees don't continue education. And there is a problem here. So these are just some general observations, and I know I don't have much time. I want now to reflect on research. How did research engage with this? Personally I read the research on education of refugees, it amazes me how apolitical it is and how uncritical it is, even problematizing what does it mean to provide education for refugees. And I think this have really resulted in some major issues. One, in a purposeless education. We hardly talk about what is the purpose of education of refugees. We provide them with an education and then they exit the system and they can't participate in the economy. They don't get any employment. They don't get any kind of status as a result of their education. So why are we educating them? And why are we so obsessed about providing them with certified education? And has been the main discussion in the Syrian crisis, is how we can provide them with certified education. And to provide them with certified education, we kind of like had to give in to the Lebanese state and provide them with this semi kind of education provision because we need the certificate. So this is we haven't engaged with this bigger question of education for what. And I think because also we have been a little bit or quite a bit apolitical, and we have kind of contributed to this research industry, we have also emphasized or contributed to the reification of refugees. We now talk about education of refugee children. Okay, and sometimes even I found myself using this terminology, and and last time May and I were talking, and May had to stop me because is there anything called education of refugees? Isn't it similar to education of any vulnerable children? In our research, several of the studies that we've done, we hardly found, or even if we found differences, very minimal differences between Lebanese disadvantaged children and refugees. Issues around language, acculturation, being irrelevant curriculum, assessment, whatsoever. Lebanese children, most disadvantaged, have been suffering from the same issues for decades, but hardly anyone has even pointed out to these issues. So this is, so I think as researchers, we need to really think, is it really different? Do we really need a field called education of refugees or not? Or maybe we need to engage with other, actually, the issue of marginalization. And this is another, what I also found very interesting is when you read the literature on education of refugee or for refugee children, you hardly see any engagement with other literature from education. We have fascinating work around disadvantaged children and education of disadvantaged children, the politics and the sociology of education and how it can marginalize this group. But we find a total disconnection between this larger literature on disadvantaging certain groups of the society because of how you design and think about education and refugee children. As if being a refugee is something permanent. It's something that will stay with you forever and will make your education needs very unique from any other child. And I think this is a problem. I'm really for bridging this gap between this bubble education for refugee children and education of other children. The other point that I also notice in the literature, for instance, particularly INE literature, is we hardly hear about refugees in the global north, as if refugees only exist in the global south. It's true, the vast majority do exist in the global south, but what about those in the global north? As if we are a network based in the global north, run by also scholars in the global north, to talk about refugees in the global south. And I think this structure needs to be really questioned a lot. And unfortunately, research grants and the industry of research doesn't help us to do this. The research industry, and Katrina and I, we collaborate on a number of projects, it's designed in a way where it always, as a scholar in the global south, I cannot be even a PI on any of these projects. Even if we co-author, even if we co-write, we can't. Now, if you meet someone who's really aware and has the ethics of equal collaboration, it works out. But for most of the time, we as researchers in the global south, and I get many requests, we're seen as just field collectors, and and a little bit kind of like fitting under the localization agenda. But it's a very tokenistic way of talking about localizing research. Localizing research means talking about power dynamics, talking about authorship, talking about publication. And all of these issues, I feel still are very, very much biased to the North. I don't know how much time I'm left. I think I've used most of my...
Minus 2.
I'm going to wrap up, and I hope we will have more time to discuss some of these issues.
Thank you very much. Very fascinating, Maha. We are always nice to listen to you, and we always have these conversations. Yeah, the idea of the obsession of certification is great. Also, one of the questions that we already have is about the marginalized children in host communities. So I guess our colleagues who are mainly practitioners do face these things that we're talking about. So I think we'll have a very engaging Q&A session. I'm looking forward to that. I'll move to Katrina. Katrina, we're looking forward to you telling us more about education and humanitarianism. Floor is yours.
Thank you so much, May. Thank you so much for organizing this Center for Lebanese Studies, and it's just really wonderful to be on this panel with two of the foremost education experts that I really admire. I'm not an education expert myself. I come more from the humanitarian development field, and I've been working more with refugees as such, I guess. So I guess my position is also then speaking from that side. And I think, as we have heard through Mario and Maha's presentations, education in emergency is now very firmly established as a core part of a global humanitarian agenda. And I think, as we have also heard, it has been a real achievement, and that it must be commended. But I think my reflections today also want to touch on some of the tensions that Maha has also mentioned now, and that we have started to unpack here in terms of this kind of education in emergencies. And I'm particularly aiming at reflecting on the tensions that we see in this approach when it's applied in situations of long-term displacement, because that's mainly where we work. So in this context, I think it's important to notice what the Interagency Network on Education in Emergencies report in their recent publications on 20 years of education in emergencies. They state that progress on refugee education has largely stood still over the last decade. Secondary enrollment rates are lower today than in 2010. And by 2019, primary school enrollment was only 77%, and the gross enrollment rate for secondary had fallen to 31%. So I think there is a need to step back at this point in time and reflect on why, despite the successes of education in emergencies, we are not able to achieve more progress in this field. So in this very short reflection, I'll bring out 3 points that we might sort of start to unpack some of this discussion. And I'm particularly concerned, I guess, with the challenge of making education part of the humanitarian agenda. And it's my view that education in this context, in a way, has absorbed some of the main problems with humanitarianism in long-term crisis. But I would also want to propose that education might be providing some very crucial answers to this problem, and that we also can think of how education can, in a way, be a response to some of the humanitarian problems. So my first point is that humanitarianism and education operate with different temporal logics that make it challenging to bring them together. I will then move to a second point, which is that the ethical foundation for humanitarianism and its humanitarian principles in many ways are in direct opposition to each other, to education. And the third point is that we need to take seriously what it would mean if we were to move from a humanitarian to a development approach in education in emergencies. So to my first point, education and humanitarianism represent different temporal logics. Education is inherently a field with a long-term perspective, focusing on the future. And in contrast, humanitarian response primarily aims at saving lives in the immediate and short term, with a very limited view to the future. With these temporal logics, the purpose of education becomes narrower, and in the case of education in emergencies, we do not see the purpose of education discussed much, as Maha said. It's taken for granted as an unmitigated good that is there to help children in the now. The relevance and meaning of education becomes less prominent when minimum standards and access take over as the main aim. With such conflicting agendas yet to be resolved, education in emergencies tend to become what Maha and I have showed elsewhere, an oxymoron, particularly when its approach is adopted in long-term refugee situations. So my second point is that the humanitarian principles contribute to a decontextualized and depoliticized approach to education. So in a way, this kind of explains some of the things that Mario and Maha already talked about. Because the ethical foundation for humanitarianism and its humanitarian principles is in direct opposition to education. Humanitarianism is grounded in principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. But despite of these principles, humanitarianism is deeply political, and the sector tend to overlook that or do not want to discuss it very much. We can see that very clearly in Lebanon, for example, where host states maintain the view that refugees, even in protracted displacement, are not supposed to stay in the host state. Host states often only agree to assistance that is temporary and relief-based. So this can be exemplified with what Maha touched on briefly earlier, that the initial position of education in emergency was to teach the curriculum to refugees of the state of origin because they were expected to return. However, with growing realization that most conflicts are protracted, there have been a call to shift towards a long-term perspective at the place of displacement, and this has resulted in the adoption of the curriculum of the host country. But in this process, leading actors like UN agencies chose to overlook some of the social, political, and economic sanctions that are applied on most refugees, such as limited access to formal employment and higher education. So this leads me to the third point, that is a central part of the humanitarian agenda today. What in education would be the consequences of moving from a humanitarian to a development approach? A development approach needs to operate with a longer time frame, attack the root causes of inequality, and create more inclusive approach by accepting the presence of refugee at the place of displacement. Education is a pertinent field to think through what development might mean in this context. And as Mario has alluded to, there are a lot of problems with the development sector and development concept as well. It's not an easy concept, but I think there are some realizations about the consequences of thinking from humanitarian to development that we need to take very seriously. So far, due to the tensions in temporal perspectives and principles, Maha and I have shown that refugees end up suffering two layers of injustice. The first results from having to follow the curriculum of the host country, which is often not in their native language, nor contextualized to be relevant to refugees' lives, culture, history, and experiences. Secondly, they face injustice because they are being excluded from the right to participate socially, economically, and politically at the place where they live and where their near future lies. So if we are to take development seriously, we need to consider how refugees can have a say in the future of the places where they live today. So my conclusion then is that in order to access these, address the double injustice in education with a humanitarian approach, there is a need to shift the logic. Currently, the ethics of humanitarianism is an individualist and universalist ethics based on the individual's act of doing good. I think a shift in an ethical foundation towards a more relational ethics, such as an ethics of care, for example, a more relational approach that factors refugees and displaced into the equation, that consider power relations on the ground and share futures at the place of displacement, might be one starting point. From here, it is about taking seriously what development would actually mean in a politically challenging environment of securing a future for refugees at the place of displacement when there is no solution in sight. It's not easy to find acceptance for a development approach. So education, we suggest, is really a very good place to start. With its inherently long-term perspective, education can pave way for new ways of thinking on how we approach development in long-term displacement. It's too easy to think that the development approach to education in emergencies would simply mean to move refugees into a national school system. With such a high proportion of refugees living in poorer communities, this approach can only lead to a shared impoverishment where existing inequalities are reproduced. So finally, I would say that a commitment to education for a future requires a shift of paradigm from survival and minimum discourse to encompass access where refugees participate on par with others, but this must be accompanied by strengthening the overall school system for all groups, and there must be actors present on the ground that also represent the refugees themselves. Thank you very much, and I'll quit there. I hope I didn't spend too much time, and I hope we can have a very interesting discussion from here.
Thank you very much, Catherine. That was a great ending and wrap up. And I think the idea and the concept of the humanitarian development nexus is very much discussed within the realm of education and emergencies. And I think it's very important that we raise it and problematize it as well, because it's not a very quick jump and it's not a straightforward thing. Also, the idea of the individualization and universalism, it's very important, particularly when we talk about the right to education. And I noticed that in terms of the work in education emergencies, no one talks about human rights. It's just like a service delivery, if you would. And I think that's also an issue. So we have a lot of questions. Since we've closed the panel with Catherine, I'll start with you for a question for you. So the question is, how do you move to a development model if refugees do not have the right to stay in a country where they find themselves?
I think this is one of the key questions. And I think this is also where the issue of the nation state that Maha mentioned earlier comes into the picture very clearly. And I don't think we talk enough about the role of the nation states in the context of protracted refugee situations. I think there are different ways of thinking about this. I think there are more acceptance of thinking about how you can improve situations for both host populations and refugees at the same time. And there are examples, from Uganda, for example, where there has been education, trying to integrate refugees and host population in the same school. But the problem is that it still doesn't sort of recognize that refugees have the same level of membership. So I think this is really a huge puzzle. I think Mark can also maybe talk to this, but we have been playing with models where you either think of a more global system of education, or you talk more local system of education. So you can also kind of bypass the state. But as we have been talking about in recent panel discussions, we also don't want to let the state off the hook. So there is also something about thinking about how that fits into the picture. And just finally, before maybe Maha can say some more, I think this is also where it is really important to think about who is representing the refugees in this discussion. And at the moment, I think there is more connection between UNHCR as the refugee agency with the nation state rather than representing the refugees themselves.
I'd like Maha to also comment on that, but I would add to it another question that links to it. What do you do if the government does not allow one to teach refugees with hosts? And I think Maha talked about also, and Katrina talked about the links to employability and other rights that are completely violated for refugees, and they're not even recognized because they're not citizens. So if you would like to comment on that, Maha.
Okay, so these are not easy questions, but what I also find very interesting is how much non-refugees can get away with versus refugees. For instance, more and more people are opting to do international baccalaureate. Their legal status is not questioned. What is your legal state? It's about your socioeconomic status. You can access the system and go anywhere and be very mobile. But if you're a refugee, you have to either be tied into a nation state or the country, the curriculum of your country of origin. And I'm wondering, and these are very political questions, the host state versus the country of origin. These are, like conflict, most refugee crises happen because of conflict. They don't happen because of earthquakes. And also this is what is interesting in emergency, even INI standards, is they don't differentiate between this. And these are, earthquakes and wars are dealt with in similar way, and this is the apoliticalness. So I think what we see in Lebanon as a case study is a genuine attempt to provide as many refugees with a certified education. Now, it looked like the most reasonable thing to do, but now that we see the outcome, where we have less than 4%, maybe that shouldn't have been our priority. Maybe the fact that we de-invested a lot in non-formal education, where we knew that refugees were having better quality of education and higher retention, although they didn't have a certified education, maybe it wasn't that bad, because anyway, even if they have, most of them won't get even a certification. But I think the Lebanese experience pushes us to think, okay, well, can we get beyond these two systems? Can we think of a third option? The option that rich people also have thought about, which is the international baccalaureate. Could we have something global? I know this doesn't solve the issue of segregation, because it still leads to segregation. But I think we have to think about, maybe these global frameworks could not be only subject to your socioeconomic background. I don't know, but I think UNHCR has to think beyond these systems. And I think at the moment, I feel UNHCR and UN agencies have felt the hostage, like they're in between the donors, mainly of governments in the global north, and the governments of the host countries, most of which are not really very they are sympathizers of refugees. One last very quick point I think we often forget are the teachers from the refugee community. This whole educational sector or group, this is skill that is, you're de-skilling this group while you're completely ostracizing them from the educational process, because most of the time they can't participate in the education. And this is another serious issue. What happens, in 20 years' time?
Yeah, or they're hired as volunteers, unpaid, completely like used and abused by NGOs as also fixers and translators and gatekeepers to the communities. So that's another ethical issue in terms of humanitarian development work. And that would take me to a question to Mario. What can we do about this? Like this whole Western hegemony, I'm guessing, will there be additional solutions that you can provide in moving forward? In particular, there are many actors working passionately in this area, and would you say that they may be unconsciously reproducing inequalities? Maybe, yeah. If so, is there something practical that we can do about this?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I tried to start with the positives precisely for that reason, to say that, there is a great deal of energy and sacrifice that is put into this field, yeah, and we have to recognize that, and people have dedicated their lives to it. But yeah, of course, there is a necessity to challenge this. So I think the solutions are implicit in the critique. Yeah. So first of all, we need to diversify. Clearly, we need to diversify the practitioners, the researchers, the funders. We need to increase the ecology of knowledge, freedom of thought, debate, discussion within this area. We also need to push back against agenda setters, gatekeepers, the powerful within this field, which is difficult when you're tied to them as funders, as service providers. There's a whole architecture there which is not conducive to speaking out. I think we should research and monitor much more the dominant institutions and dominant players. I've raised this in other areas. I've always called for a education in emergencies watch, where we should monitor the behaviors and practices of the field, not as some kind of politically correct phenomena, but actually as a contribution to the field, to say that, you need to be challenged and pressed. And then I think that then there is a final thing which gets down to the grassroots, is I do think that there should be a kind of a code of practice for practitioners, for researchers, that addresses some of the particularities of this, because I do believe that there is a lot of things that are ethically questionable about this. There's something about, nothing about me without me kind of arguments, these kind of, that you need to have participation and of different communities in decisions, much more democratic processes. It feels to me very much top down, a lot of this processes, and dominated by certain countries and certain actors, which we need to push back against. So those are some of my suggestions. I think that of the things that, you know, Ricardo has asked about, you know, kind of what is to be done, which, look, you know, I teach development studies as well, and I always start the class and say, you know, development is, you know, terrible things have been done in the name of international development. We need to recognize that. It's not a romantic field, yeah, but it does project that. And the same with education emergencies. There is a kind of moralism, oh, we're doing good and therefore we can't be critiqued. Well, no, we have to look at the facts and the realities. We know a lot of damage has been done in the name of international development and in the name of education and emergencies, and we need to address that and move forward and try to make things better. And I remain in the field for that reason, not otherwise I'll go somewhere else if I abandoned all hope.
Thank you, Mario. Okay, I'll move. There are so many questions, and unfortunately we won't be able to answer all of them, but I picked a question that's related to our very recent context in terms of COVID-19 and education in emergencies, education for refugees and marginalized groups. And I would like to put Maha in that corner, sorry. How did COVID and the shift to online learning impacted inclusion? Because you work on inclusion a lot. What other tools and technologies that we can develop to improve inclusion and refugee education?
Mm-hmm. So, you and I, our study on of COVID-19 in Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine, which was published a few months ago, showed that refugees generally were not accommodated in distance learning. It was left last year. It was left up to the principal's discretion to do arrangement for online learning for refugees. The vast majority of refugees are not receiving education, whether informal or non-formal. Currently, teachers of second shift schools are on strike because they're not being paid, and because also they're being paid differently for online versus non-online education. So there are some serious issues concerning, and this is back to your point, May, is it a right or it's not a right? And who are considered to be the priority. And I feel this is also the issue of how, how refugee status within the host country system, and racism is something that we experience every day. For a country that is crumbling anyway, and financially and economically in a critical stage, the state can hardly maintain its duties towards its citizens, let alone refugees. So refugees are always going to be abandoned and the first group to pay the price. And most countries are also going to suffer with the bill of the cost of doing education, paying for the cost of refugee education. So this is why I think refugees are suffering more. Children with learning disabilities are seen as one of the major groups to be also marginalized and excluded, but also teachers. Teachers are often, exploited more in distance education, and we hardly talk about this. And what I also find very striking is how little we as research institutes and as the universities are doing. Think about faculties of education. How many faculties of education have really responded or engaged or attempted to support teachers and schools and marginalized groups in their attempt to provide and make up whatever kind of provisions they could with the technology they have? Yet what I found amazing about in Lebanon is I never expected teachers would be engaged now in workshops on distance learning. Although they're not paid and they are exploited and they have to work longer hours and they have to pay for the cost of the technology, they're still trying hard. So I think there's a duty also on us as research institutes and knowledge producers to also pay also our duty.
Thank you very much, Maha. I think that the next question is very long, but I think it raises really important points. So I'll just try to read through it. And I think it would be to Katrina and then Mario, if you would like to comment. If we know that donors have never and will likely never engage in politics that do not support their own interests and agendas, can a donor-based system ever truly be emancipatory? If not, what are the ethical implications for the large number of critical researchers who at once are endeavoring to speak back to donors while also working with, for or through these same agencies and organizations? I think I'll stop here and then I'll continue after. So it's about, I guess, Maha, it's something we normally discuss as well. It's the ethics of knowledge production, Katrina, and we talked about this before. So if you would like to comment on this.
Oh, it's a difficult question. I think, you know, even though there is that dominance of some actors, there is those politics, and I think there is a deeply embedded problem in both when it comes to knowledge production and practice in development and humanitarianism that really kind of is inherited in this kind of colonial system in many ways. I wouldn't totally give up, because I do think that there are developments and there are opening of discussions, and what I have seen, I think particularly is particularly in a project I did a few years ago where I interviewed humanitarian workers in different fields, like from, you know, field workers to sort of middle managers to top managers, that there are those discourses around, and there is a willingness to actually grapple with some of those discussions. And I don't think that it's kind of completely lost, but the system is a bit stuck, I would say. So I think there is a real need to really think about how we actually open up the discourse and continue and make a pressure around that. And I think one really interesting thing at the moment, and again, I fear that it's just being co-opted by a kind of buzzwords, the localization, you know, development, all those things. But at the same time, if we can, you know, keep up the pressure and the discourses, I think there are ways of also thinking that we could also shift some of the relations, and that's where the ethics come in. I think there is also, I think, a kind of beginning of a critique around the humanitarian principles that you know, there is that kind of opening up. So again, I feel that there are these kind of glimmers of hope, and that there is a possibility, but you know, I think we need to make sure that we are staying together, but also that we create alternative networks, and networks that maybe have, you know, as Mario said earlier, has a greater diversity, and that we can find ways of representing that diversity. And I do feel that it's a lot of opening for that at the moment, but some of it is voluntary work. I'm afraid it's not everything that can be done with resources either. But I'm sure Mario and Maha also have a lot to say about this.
Thank you. Mario, would you like to comment on this? Like, if you're an individual who has a critical approach within an institution that pushing a certain agenda, which is mainstream, let's say, how would you do it? How would you struggle politically and resist that kind of approach?
Well, just going back to the issue of can states, you know, can a donor state system ever be progressive? I mean, I think that that's difficult to talk about at the moment, when we're in a very reactionary period where states have been captured and development budgets have been captured by national governments with clear ambitions to divert those funds towards their own economic interests and their own security interests, right? So I talk about the UK in particular, but it could apply to many of the other powerful countries. But I do believe that the state, after following Poulantzas, the social theorist, is a social relation, no? So challenging your own governments, overthrowing your own governments, and creating alternative societies would create the conditions under which there will be more progressive politics. And we see this over the history of development, no? That there are periods when Western states have had a more ethical foreign policy, not necessarily completely ethical, but there are balances, there's shifts and changes, and we've seen it, you know, post 9/11 is a really bad period for that. Yeah, the last 20 years have not looked very good. But I do believe that there are always potential for internationalism and solidarity between nations to support more progressive process. Otherwise, you wouldn't stay in this field. Right, I think that. And then on the issue of, you know, what would you do? I mean, look, I think going to Edward Said's famous words, yeah, being an uncritical intellectual is a waste of your life. Yeah. You know, there's nothing worse than that, he used to say. Yeah, there's nothing worse than an intellectual pandering to power, being silent in public debates, not speaking back, not speaking truth to power. Yeah, I think that, of course, there are sometimes consequences for those things, and of course it depends on your subject positionality. I recognize all of those things. Yeah. But as I've traveled through my own career, from PhD student to junior lecturer, I've always thought that the best way to do that was to speak out, and of course build alliances with similar-minded people within your institution, between institutions, and build alternative networks that support you. And I think that, you know, that's about our own community labor. Yeah. And as senior academics, we try and do that. I try and do that all the time, and create the opportunities and networks for critical scholars so that they can develop and flourish. But, you know, there's also always a price to be paid for that. And I think that we have to assume that and do our best to succumb. Otherwise, wasting a life. Yeah. A great life.
Sure. Thank you very much, Mario. Maha, last words for you before we close. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about your ideas about South-South collaboration and the internationalism of solidarity and support, maybe from your own perspective, because I know you talk a lot about that, and it's a very interesting approach.
So, you know, okay, so I'll have to say the past 10 years have been a learning curve for me, and I'm still learning so much. And I've learned something that, you know, good intentions are very good, but they're not enough. And I think sometimes we enter fields, and particularly when there's a humanitarian crisis, we really want to do something good, and the intentions are potentially very good. But I think as researchers, our role is to be critical. And to also challenge the structure that allows us to do this. And I think at the moment, the way research collaborations are created, they unfortunately maintain the hegemony still of the global north over the south. Knowledge production is still dominated and still works that way. I'm not saying that there aren't other ways that are happening, but I think the more we can have south, 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 north, really equal collaborations, collaborative collaborations, where we think, we critique, we rethink. It's okay. What, you know, I think what we've tried to do over the 20 years is great. It's good progress. Finally, you know, we're talking about this. 10 years ago, we wouldn't have been having this discussion. So this is something really good. I don't want to at all to do, you know, not to commend the efforts, but I think it's time for us to think critically, even when we want to develop alternative systems. Even if I'm in the global north and I'm really doing my best, I think it's important to question, am I really taking into account what really refugees think, or the local community think, or so I think this is something very important when we're speaking on someone's behalf. So I hope we will have more discussions like this, and I hope we will have next time people also from the INI network and other scholars from different parts of the global south who can also share with us their experiences.
Thank you very much, Maha. Words of wisdom, great to end with. I'm really sorry for all the participants who we couldn't answer your questions, and I'm afraid we have reached the end of our webinar today. I'd like to thank you, the three speakers, for such great perspective and critical analysis that left all of us, I'm sure, with so much to think about, and hopefully, as Maha said, move forward and have more discussions. That's not the end of the road, of course. That's just the start of an opening of a very critical space, and we're always happy to receive questions and get engaged with this discussion. It was an eye-opener and a pleasure to listen to you. Thank you very much. And just a reminder for our audience, I've shared 3 links in the chat box, so if you would like to copy them and take them and read them after the webinar before they go once we are closed, we close this webinar. And of course, before we close, I thank those who joined us today for such an engaging discussion and many, many great questions. Sorry for not answering all of them. So thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your evening or day, depending where you are, and hope for you to join us soon for more webinars and discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.